Thank you.
Welcome to our 5th Book Sandwiched In presentation for 2020. I'm Barbara Cook, co-chair with Bev Stevens of the Book Sandwiched In series. As always, there are refreshments at the counter and table at the side of the room, and Brad is at the back of the room manning the membership table. He would like to have lots of new memberships today, so by all means, stop by. Today, our presenter is Mary Franklin. A longtime resident of Painted Post, Mary attended SUNY Geneseo, where she majored in special education, and Marycrest College in Iowa, where she received her master's in education. She retired as a special education teacher with 36 years of service, most at the former East High School, and is now a member of this Corning Painted Post School Board, where she is in her 3rd term. Mary also volunteers at the Rockwell Museum and the Heritage Village of the Southern Finger Lakes. In addition, she is a member of the Corning Area Women's Club and Delta Kappa Gamma, as well as a handbell ringer at Christ Episcopal Church. And somehow, she also finds time for exercising at the Y, and of course, reading. For many years, Mary has vacationed in the Carolinas, which gives her a close feeling for today's book, Where the Crawdads Sing, by Delia Owens. And now, a warm welcome for my friend Mary Franklin and her presentation.
Well, thank you very much. I guess I should start out by saying I've never done this before. I haven't been to one before, so I'm a little overwhelmed. I thought maybe there might be, 10, 15 people. But I just came from doing a tour at the Rockwell with 17 kindergartners, so I can handle them. I can handle you. So my first question is, how many people have read the book? Because that kind of makes a difference. Oh, okay, good. There is a bit of a twist at the end, and I don't want to give it away. I know that I'm the kind of person that if somebody tells me, it's like, well, I'm not going to read it now. You ruined the whole thing. Other people may not think that way, but we'll try not to give that part away. Well, as most of you probably know then, the book was published in August of 2018, and it's been on the New York Times bestseller list for well over 72 weeks now. Wow. And everybody that I've talked to and mentioned that I was going to do this book, they all loved it. So that's a good thing, and that shows why it's been on the list for so long. So I want to talk a little bit about the author, because I find her life story fascinating. Delia Owens grew up in rural Georgia, and she was always a fan of the outdoors. She ended up going to college, University of Georgia, and got a bachelor degree in zoology, and then went on to get a PhD at University of California in Davis in animal behavior. And then shortly after she graduated, she and her then husband left for Africa. They decided they wanted to use their time and talent to study the animals in Africa. And they spent the next 24 years in Africa. So she and her husband are no longer together, but they did a lot of great work, and they authored some books. So she is the co-author of 3 international best-selling nonfiction books, all about her life in the wilds of Africa. One of them was Cry of the Kalahari, The Eye of the Elephant, and The Secrets of the Savannah. So she has won the John Burroughs Award for natural writing. She's been published in Nature, the African Journal of Ecology, and International Wildlife, among many others. And she currently lives in Idaho. She came back after she and her husband divorced, and she wanted somewhere rural, somewhere where there was nature, because she is still a nature girl. And where she lives in Iowa is very close to the Canadian border, and there's really just wide open spaces. So she has a ranch of sorts with horses and all sorts of animals, and she absolutely loves it there. Although she continues to support the wildlife in Zambia, but she needed to come home. Now, Where the Crawdads Sing is her first novel, and she is 70 years old. So from what interviews that I looked at, she started writing this in her 60s after she came back. It took her 10 years to put it down, and she basically wanted to express the feelings of being alone and being isolated and its effect, how it had been an effect on her and the protagonist in the story. I found her method of writing kind of interesting because it did take her 10 years. And she said, when being interviewed, that she keeps a pad by her bed. And so whenever she gets a thought in the middle of the night, she tries to write it down. And then when she reads it in the morning, she can't read it, or it's so gibberish it makes no sense. But there was one that she said did resonate, and I found it a very interesting quote. And that is, "Sand keeps secrets much better than mud." That just came to her in the middle of the night, and so that's, think about that one as you were drifting off to sleep tonight. So the title was very interesting to me because Where the Crawdads Sing. Well, first of all, crawdads don't sing. I looked that up on Wikipedia. And I'm not sure how many people know what a crawdad is. So I brought a visual. So crawdads apparently go by basically 3 different names. Crawdads, crawfish, or as I knew them, crayfish. And they're found all over the country. And depending on what part of the country you live in is the name that you go by. Just like some people call it soda, some people call it pop, some people call all soda Coke. So crawdad was the name that she grew up knowing because she came from rural Georgia. And my children used to look for crayfish at Cuca Lake, so I know they're around here and in the streams as well. But the title actually came from something her mother said to her. And if you've read this, you probably know this quote. It's at the very beginning of the book where Delia writes to the reader. And she said, "My mother encouraged us to explore the forest as far as we could go, to observe the deer, and hope to see a fox. And she would always say, go way out yonder where the crawdads sing." And that's what obviously Delia did. She went to Africa. That's pretty far out. But that quote comes up a couple other times in the book. And one of them isn't until chapter 17, where Kaya is speaking with a friend that she meets, a boy named Tate, and we'll talk a little bit more about him later. But she was trying to keep away from some folks. In this case, it was social services who were looking for her. And she said, Jumpin' said that social services are looking for me, and I'm scared they're going to pull me in like a trout and put me in a foster home or something. Well, says Tate, we better hide way out where the crawdads sing. I pity any foster parent who takes you on. What do you mean, where do the crawdads sing? My ma used to say that. Kaya remembered Mom always encouraging her to explore the marsh. Go as far as you can. Go way out yonder where the crawdads sing. So, when I looked at the cover of the book, I thought it was inviting, and oftentimes that's what draws me to a book, is just the cover. But I also absolutely love the inside, because when I remember my trips to Murrells Inlet in South Carolina and on parts of the shore of North Carolina, this is what I remember seeing. Now, not just the beach, but the actual inlet, where people did still look for shrimps and crawdads and scallops or whatever. And this is, I could relate to that. So, understand that last week, Brian Wiesenhall was here. Wiesenhall, excuse me. And not to be outdone by Brian, because I know Brian. I couldn't find crawdads, but my husband, the biologist, said they are crustaceans and this is as close as you're going to get. So there, Brian, anyway, another interesting distinction that I found at the very beginning of the book, in the prologue, which I did not know, was the difference between a marsh and a swamp. Did everybody know there was a difference? I didn't know that. But in the prologue, a marsh is not a swamp. A marsh is a space of light where grass grows in the water and the water flows into the sky. Swamp water is dark and still. A swamp is quiet because decomposition is at cellular work here. Life decays and reeks and returns to the rotted dump. A poignant swallow of death begetting life. So, as those of you who've read the book know, the main character, Kaya, goes by many names in the book. And one of them, or rather derogatory, is the swamp, or the marsh girl. She's not the swamp girl. And that's a huge distinction that many in the town don't understand. That she is so much more knowledgeable and full of life than many of those folks are. So I looked at some other book reviews of this, and I think most people found it very hard to categorize what kind of a story this particular novel is. Because it is one part coming-of-age story, because we follow Kaya through her life. It is one part murder mystery. That's how it starts off. It's one part love story. And of course, there is that surprise ending twist at the end that we're not going to talk about. But it is a story of a impoverished, abusive, dysfunctional family. And I could relate to that because as a former special ed teacher, many of my students came from situations as dire as this. And it broke my heart then, and it broke my heart as I read this book. There's also two timelines that are interwoven throughout the book. And at first, I found it a little difficult to keep flipping back and forth. It starts off in 1969 with the murder, and then it jumps back in time to 1952, where we meet Kaya at age 6. And it just finally got the swing of it as we moved through the book and the stories became intertwined. So some of the words that people have said about this book is that it's heartbreakingly unforgettable, it's deeply symbolic, it's hauntingly atmospheric, it's stunning, it's enchanting, it's emotive, and as I said, I found it very relatable and engaging, and I didn't want the story to end. And there aren't too many books that I feel that way about. By the time I reach the end of some books, it's like, oh, I hate it. I'm one of those people that if I start a book, darn it, I'm going to finish it. Even if I can't stand it, I have to finish it. But this was not like that. So this is the story of Kaya and how she rises above and survives. But more than that, she flourishes. And as I said, Kaya, if you've read the book, you know that Kaya was abandoned as a young girl by her entire family. And she basically had to raise herself in a shack in the depths of an isolated marsh. And she was surrounded by nothing but the pulsing natural world. And she learned about herself and others by watching all of the inhabitants of the marsh. So, besides the name Kaya, which was the name that her family called her, her real name was Catherine Danielle Clark. And then she was also then called the Marsh Girl by the folks in the town that she lived. But interesting enough, she came from a family of 5 children, parents. She didn't really even know the names, the given names, the real names of her siblings, because one by one they had wandered off and left the family because of the abusive nature. But she does find an old Bible as she's rummaging and cleaning and what have you, and it makes her wonder, who am I? If these people that I thought I knew go by other names. So in the Bible, she finds her own name and her date of birth, which she didn't even really know when her birthday was. And then she has Master Jeremy Andrew Clark, who was her closest brother, Jody. And then there was Miss Amanda Margaret Clark, her sister Mandy, and Master Napier Murphy Clark, who went by Murph. And then the oldest was Miss Mary Helen Clark, who went by Missy. So the search for her own identity was tied up in the identity of her siblings, who she really didn't spend much time with them because she was only 6 when her mother left. And that's how the story actually begins to draw, at least it began to draw me in. Because one day, her mother, who was the center of her life, just left. She saw her pack her bags, she saw her walk down the road in her high heels, and she left. And she never came back. And every day, Kaya would look for her mother and hope that she would come back, but she didn't. And we learn later on in the book why that happened, why that was so, and why, even though she tried to get in touch with Maya or Kaya, it didn't happen. So Kaya had to develop her own identity, and she did that through her association with all of the animals in the marsh. And as those of you who've read the book know, she became self-taught expert in all of the creatures of the marsh, going on to write best-selling books on the creatures. And because she was such a wonderful artist, she was able to illustrate these books. But one of the important themes that I found in this book is the importance of education. And Kaya went to school one day. Basically, social services came. They realized that she was probably living there on her own, and they dragged her to school. And it was such an embarrassing and humiliating experience that she was determined she would never go back. So she didn't know how to read, she didn't know how to write, and it wasn't until she met this wonderful young man named Tate, who kind of helped her when she was a little bit lost. She had borrowed her father's motorboat, and as you remember, she kind of got off track and kind of lost her way, and Tate guided her back, and they developed this wonderful friendship. And when he realized that she didn't know how to read or write, he took it upon himself to teach her, and she learned very quickly. So there's a quote, one of the first lines that she ever was able to read all by herself, and it's so related to Kaya because it is her. Slowly she unraveled each word of the sentence, and I can hear her in my mind because I worked with students who didn't know how to read, and they would draw out the letters and try to sound it out, and I can hear her saying, and she probably said it more than once until it made meaning. But the sentence said, there are some who can live without wild things, and there's some who cannot. Oh, she said, oh, you can read, Kaya? There'll never be a time again when you can't read. But it ain't just that, she spoke almost in a whisper. I wasn't aware that words could hold so much. I didn't know a sentence could be so full. And he smiled, and he said, that's a very good sentence. Not all words hold that much. So that power of education took her a long way. And once she started reading, and once Tate kept bringing her books, and he bought lots of biology books because that was her interest, and she just soaked it up like a sponge. And then she dragged out her mother's old art equipment and began drawing some of the pictures of the animals that she was seeing, and writing descriptions and talking about their way of life. And at one point in the story, Tate said, he said, this is really good. You should turn this in. I bet you could get it published. And Kai is incredulous. She said, who's going to want to read this? But they did. And she went on to write many books and became well-known bestseller of this nonfiction, kind of like our author, Delia. Another theme that I think goes through the book is the power of connection. Because Kaya, as everybody left her, including her closest brother Jody, and then eventually even her father, she's alone in this shack, and she feels that loneliness and isolation, but doesn't trust people, doesn't know how to deal with these feelings. But she knows, as she does watching the animals, that you can't survive by yourself. So she does make some friends, and there is a couple that take her under their wing, provide her with supplies and clothing, and they happen to be an African-American couple who were not quite as low as being a Marsh girl, but they were not, well respected in the town either. So they had that connection. And so that was a safe spot, a place where she could go and get help when she needed it. And she did. But, find this quote. You probably remember that there was besides Tate, who really became her first love, Tate leaves and goes to college. And, as young men are bound to do, he got busy, and even though he might have tried to come back and see her at times, it just didn't work. And so she felt that he had abandoned her, and she was looking for that connection. And unfortunately, she found it in the arms of another character, Chase, who was not a good guy. He was not good. So she's talking to her brother and telling him about the fact that Tate has abandoned her, and talking about this new love, which Jody doesn't think is a good thing. But he says, her brother says to her, I'm so sorry, I am Kaya, but it's not just guys who are unfaithful. I've been duped and dropped and run over a few times myself. Let's face it, sometimes love just doesn't work out. Yet, even when it fails, it connects you to others. And in the end, that's all you have, connection. Look at us. You and I, we have each other now. And just think, if I have kids and you have kids, well, that's a whole another string of connections. And on it goes. And Kaya, if you really do love Tate, then take a chance. So sometimes we do have to take a chance. And eventually, she does. And as those of you, again, who've read the book know, it works out very well for them. But Chase is a whole other kind of connection. He's a user. And, many of us have had an experience of wanting to be with someone so badly that we overlook all of their failings. And he took advantage of that. He got what he wanted, at the same time becoming engaged to someone else. And when Kaya finds out about that, she again feels, totally betrayed. Now she's been betrayed by two. And it's frustrating for her and very, very sad. And she doesn't know what to do with those feelings. So one of the things she does is she writes poems. Well, she loved poetry. That was one of the books that she found when she first began to read. And there was a couple that I really liked. One of them, and not necessarily titled, but see who you think this refers to. I must let go now, let you go. Love is too often the answer for staying, but too seldom the reason for going. I drop the line and watch you drift away. All along you thought that fiery current of your lover's breast pulled you into the deep, but it was my heart tide releasing you to float adrift with seaweed. And then another one that I really liked. Fading moon, follow my footsteps through light unbroken by land shadows, and share my senses that feel the cool shoulders of silence. Only you know how one side of a moment is stretched by loneliness for miles to the other edge, and how much sky is in one breath when time slides backward from the sand. Because if anyone knows and understands loneliness, the moon would. And so she, at that point, she just buried herself deeper in the wilderness, and nature seemed to be the only thing that had not deserted her. So, throughout the book, I also found little snippets of advice, and they didn't always come across as advice, but I think that's what really they are. She remembers one thing that she learned from her mother, and the quote was, "When in trouble, just let go, go back to idle." So she was thinking about that as she was in her boat, and she wasn't going where she needed to go. And this just kind of popped into her mind, and she released the throttle and let the boat just drift. But I like that. If you're in trouble, let it go. Go back to idle. Pause. And sometimes things right themselves. Another one that I liked, if I can find it. So this is again from her mother. "Lying there," Ma said, "you all listen now. This is a real life lesson. Yes, we got stuck, but what are we girls going to do? We make it fun. We laughed, and that's what sisters and girlfriends are all about. Sticking together, even in the mud, especially in the mud." So I liked that quote because it goes back to the author. Delia said that was one of the reasons that she came back to the United States from Africa, is that she missed that connection with her girlfriends. That girlfriends give us a connection that we can't get. Sorry guys. We can't get from just anyone, even your spouse or your best friend. But that was the one thing that she missed. And Kaya really never had that experience. She never was able to make connections and have girlfriends. First of all, she didn't understand what all their thinking was. She would follow girls from the school, and she would watch what they did, and just none of it made any sense to her. And one last piece of advice that I liked. And this refers back to her relationship with Chase. And this is what happened to her. Meeting people ended in hurt. That was her experience. And so she tried to just shut herself off, stay in the marsh where she understood the animals and the plants and the tides and the waters, and just that was her. That's where she felt the most at home. Luckily, it did improve, and she did make some other connections. She goes to visit her publisher in a city, and the first time she'd ever really been out of the marsh and stayed in a hotel and had a fancy dinner, but it was very uncomfortable for her. Again, a parallel back to the author. When I watched some interviews with her, she said, all this publicity, all this is wonderful, but she said, it's just not me. I'm very uncomfortable in the spotlight. And you could tell on the video where she was being interviewed on, I think, one of the news stations, she was looking around like a deer in the headlights. It just wasn't comfortable for her. She said, give me the mountains, give me my horse to ride, and that's where I'm happiest. So, the one great thing about this book is that I learned it's going to be made into a movie. Reese Witherspoon has met with Delia and has bought the movie rights to the book. I believe Delia is helping to write the screenplay for the movie. I have no idea when it will be out, but for me, that's a gotta see. I just gotta see it. I always try to, as I'm reading a book, kind of picture the main characters, and I really can't think of who could play Kaya, because they're going to have multiple actresses for all the different stages of her life. So I think it'll be, and I think whether Reese is in the movie or not, any projects that she's been involved in, I've really enjoyed. So I think it will really be a great movie. So we have a few minutes left, and I really wanted to open it up to questions or comments, or what were your thoughts about the book, so that we can relate to each other a little bit. So, what was your favorite part, or was there a character that you especially related to, and why?
Yes. It's quite remarkable that she's able to do what she is to survive, and especially at a young age. With your experience, did you feel it as plausible that she would be able to, she really took care of herself?
I have students who, they weren't living in a marsh, but they were living in a shack, pretty much, sometimes with no plumbing, sometimes with dirt floors, and sometimes their responsibility was for the other kids. So I did find it. And when you think about when this story took place in 1952, in rural North Carolina, I think it's very plausible. Because those marshes and swamps, historically, were the swamp people that lived there. They kind of came in and were squatters and took over parts of the area that nobody else wanted. They weren't able to be developed. They didn't think there was anything worth money in that land, so they let these people just live there. They never paid taxes. They didn't go to school. They just lived off the land. So I think so, definitely. Yes.
I like that African-American couple, the gentleman who martyred with her. Obviously, he lost most of the martyrs. She was very young to get gasoline for her.
Yes. Jumpin' and Mabel. I love them. They were wonderful, really. And they saved her on multiple occasions. They would tell her when social services was going to be coming, and you better hide out, because they knew that they would never find her. Yeah, that was a good positive connection. Yes.
I feel this conundrum between this theme of loneliness and the author now going to live in top of Idaho, and yet you say, she said the reason she came back was wanting connection with girlfriends, but I don't know whether
I think she's able to connect with those friends from way back when, and but on her choice, on her level, but she still has to have that wide open space. So I think it is a conundrum. I agree with you, but she's an interesting person. I would love to sit down and talk with her, because I think she's had so many experiences. But yeah, I think she knows what she wants. She wants to have that connection with someone. And I never read anywhere where they had children, so I didn't see that anywhere. So, but she does have friends, and she does see them on a sort of regular basis. They come in, they get together, they do their weekend, and so it's an interesting. And I think Kaya's kind of like that. She craves that connection, but yet give her the wide open spaces is really where she's happiest.
But did the author talk about what she was like when she was young? I mean, was she mostly alone, or did she?
I don't think so, but she was encouraged by her mother to go out and explore. I mean, I don't know, that she didn't give a whole lot of information about her background, and I frankly couldn't find, I didn't dig as deep as perhaps I could have to find out, but, you know, she did have siblings, but they were just encouraged to go out and explore, and, you know, it was kind of the time when you didn't worry so much about, you know, you sent your kids off, you know, after breakfast, and, you know, didn't worry about them coming back for dinner, they just did, and that was a different time. Now we can't do that kind of thing, but, yeah, I would like to find out more about her.
You know, I read that book quite a while ago, but I didn't remember the title, of course. But why were those men after her? Do you remember the men in the boat? And she was trying to escape from them, you know?
I don't want to give too much away for those that haven't, but she does get, as I did mention, there is a murder. That's how the story starts off, and she gets embroiled in that as one of the suspects.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of, they were looking for her
Yeah.
because they wanted to interview her and see, you know, what her involvement might
Oh, I
have
just couldn't remember why.
been. Yeah.
It was quite a book.
Yeah.
I stuck with it.
Good, it's well worth it.
I read her first nonfiction book along with her husband, and they're doing this research in a very remote area of Africa on a shoestring of a budget, and they're trying to write grants for just hundreds of dollars, not any huge amount. But she does point out that when they went back into the nearest town, how much they enjoyed that and realized for the first time that they missed and craved that human relationship, even though they were very close to the animals. So that part in her own life is
Parallels,
what
yeah.
you see in the
Yeah,
book.
so she's, you know, she's definitely, you know, got almost two different personalities where she wants it, but not too much of it, and wants a place to go and get away when it becomes overwhelming. Anybody else?
I'm curious, how do you think things might have turned out if she had to go to school?
You know what? I hate to say this, but I think they would have broken her spirit, and she probably never would have, you know, written those wonderful naturalist books that she did, because you know, I just remember from kindergarten, my own kindergarten class, you had to stay within the lines. You had to color exactly the way it was, and Kaya was not like that. She was a wild spirit, and I think they would have broken her. I do.
Any indication of what writers might have influenced the author?
You know, she didn't really mention that, so I don't know the answer to that question. I think she, you know, being a zoologist and, you know, doctor in animal behavior, I would suspect that's the kind of books that she read and enjoyed. She didn't really ever mention anywhere that I read anyway about any particular novels of that sort, so I don't know.
Is she gonna write more fiction?
She is working on another book right now, and the person interviewing him said, well, I hope to God it doesn't take you another 10 years. And she said, yeah, because then I'll be 80.
The business of jumping back and forth in time could have been very annoying. And early in the book, I decided, look, we're meeting a new person. And when you meet a new person, you only know a little bit. And then there's a jump back and you hear something about her childhood or her family or something. And it really meant that through the whole book, with that jumping back and forth, that you felt you were more and more gradually becoming to know her as you would if you met a new person. And I found that particularly delightful.
Yeah, and I agree. At first, it was annoying because it's like I'm just starting to get involved in this storyline, and then they switch it, you know, all this time earlier. But then, as you say, you could see how everything that happened to her was leading up to what happened in 1969.
And then, of course, as it ended, you realize there's the ultimate, oh, I really know you now.
Exactly. The one thing I thought about as we're going through, you know, she was always observing the nature around here. So she was very familiar with predator versus prey. And depending on which part of the story you were looking at, sometimes she was the predator, sometimes she was the prey. And she did, I think she realized that, especially at the end.
I found it interesting, as you described in the beginning of the book, that she is surrounded by nothing but the natural world. And the natural world is so full, and it's what she becomes intimate with, and she eventually writes these books. Certainly learning to read and write was crucial to be able to do that. But that's what her world was, and what she shared with others, and which brought her to enjoy whatever accoutrements any of us would want in what we might call a successful life. But it's still that thought that if we don't have some of the civilization kind of things around us, that we're considered as having not such a full life, and yet the natural world is so full. And when the dystopian type novels are generally set in bombed out cities. So even though we think of, it's just an interesting contrast with the natural world as being, it's not enough, and yet it is such a full thing in the way she describes
And I mean, her observations were so astute, and then the drawings that went with them, the publisher said nobody has ever done anything like this. There's nothing that's ever been published like this. And I always told my students, I said, we're not all smart the same way, but we're all smart. And it's my job to help you figure out how are you smart. And she figured that out all by herself. She didn't have to go to school to figure that out.
Anybody else?
Well, it's almost one, and there are some crawdads over there, so I don't want to take them home, so. Thank you very much. And I want to thank you so much, Mary, for a really interesting and a lot of new thoughts in your head, I'm sure, about this book, even those of you who have read it. The many themes that were expressed and so on, I think you clarified for us so well what was in that book. And everybody, we all should make a special thank you for the shrimp. That is a big deal for everybody, I'm sure. And I also want to remind you, shrimp being the operative word there, I want you to remember last week there were macarons that we had that were so excellent.
Yes.
Yes, well, Bev Stevens, genius as she is, has found out who the chef, the bakery chef is. She's gotten the name and contact info, and we'll share it with you. Just see Bev there. She's back there. You know what she looks like. And she has little slips of paper that have all the information you need if you want to go and investigate for yourself. Next week, for our last book sandwiched in this year, Christine Atkins from CCC will review Rising Out of Hatred, The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist by Eli Saslow. I hope we'll see you all then for a different kind of book. And remember, before you grab your shrimp, remember to lift your chairs and put them away, and then your reward is the shrimp. Thanks again, Mary.